Hi, I'm Richard Weiss, former president of the Explorers Club, and I'd like to welcome you to the Explorers Club 50 lecture series. If you're new to the club and to the lecture series, I'd like to welcome you and tell you a little about ourselves and also about the Explorers Club 50. First of all, the Explorers Club was established in 1904. At that time, by a bunch of guys trying to get to the North and South Pole. And since that time, our members have covered just about every corner of the earth. In fact, when you walk into the lobby of our historic headquarters on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, there is a plaque on the wall that perhaps summarizes it best. Our members have been the first to step foot on the North Pole, first on the South Pole, first to stand upon Mount Everest, the highest point, the first to go to the lowest point in the ocean, and also our members were the first to go to the moon. Other notable explorers have been Theodore Roosevelt and Jane Goodall, and just about every notable explorer of the 21st century. Now about the Explorers Club 50. The slogan is 50 people who are changing the world that the world needs to know about. And I'll give you a little genesis of how that started. Last spring, during the beginning of the pandemic, one of our members said to me, "You've got to check out this performance or this video called Earthrise by a young poet named Amanda Gorman." I watched it, and it was about the Apollo 8 mission, which were our members. And I was blown away by how she described Earth, the environment, and the fragility of our planet. We started a short correspondence and became pen pals. She became a member. But I also thought, how many other Amanda Gormans are out there in the world? In fact, when I got together with the chair of this program, Joe Rohde, who you'll be meeting in just a few minutes, we got together and we said, how do we want to describe exploration in the future? And if we're truly a global exploration society, then our club has to represent the world as we see it. And not just in terms of how people look, but also how people describe the earth and the sky and just about everything in science. So how did we choose the EC50 honorees, 50 people who are changing the world that the world needs to know about? The first thing Joe Rohde said to me was that if you take a problem and you approach it with the same people, you are always going to get the same type of result. So he immediately said, we wanted as diverse a judging panel, people who could look at the world through a different narrative and lens and be able to come together with some sort of conclusion. So he put together a group that was from all over the world. The next thing we had to do is have our membership give us people that they have met along the way that were doing incredible things that maybe weren't recognized for their work. We got about 450 nominations. And I have to tell you, they were pretty amazing. We could have gotten an EC 200 out of it. We came out with our top 50 honorees, and the result was nothing less than spectacular. We have people covering all sectors of disciplines from space to paleontology, oceanography. We have Inuit, Native Americans, Sri Lankans, Indians, Africans, and just across the border. So this is the inaugural lecture series, and we'll have a few more that'll be rolling out over the week. But in the meantime, I want you to sit back and enjoy some good old-fashioned storytelling.
Welcome once again to the Explorers 50 series, this one titled Innovators. In this case, we're diving into a couple people whose lives and work revolve around the world of plants, people, culture, and the interface between these things. One of them is Professor Robbie Hart, who is director of the William L. Brown Center at the Missouri Botanical Garden. And the other is Brandi DeCarli, who is one of the creators of Farm from a Box, which produces sustainable agricultural systems that can be distributed around the world. Both of them are doing remarkable things out in the world of exploration. And let's just see what they have to say about their work.
Hello, everyone. My name is Brandi DeCarli, and together with Scott Thompson, we are the founders of Farm from a Box. The technology and innovation have played such a crucial role in enabling human exploration. It's basically made the impossible possible. Within the agricultural sector, that has certainly rung true. It has also ushered in an era of industrialized food production that has wreaked havoc on our planet and on our health. Well, we are working to change that. Rather than furthering an extractive industry, we're looking to apply clean technology to uplift regional and local food systems and enable people to grow their own food localized in a much more sustainable, productive, and efficient way. Instead of mass production, our mission is to empower the masses through production. Now, the idea for this struck several years ago when Scott and I were working on a project in Kenya. We were utilizing modified shipping containers to build a youth empowerment center and bring in some of the resources that the community lacked. That was largely around education, health, and sport at the time. Well, we found that there was a foundational need of healthy food access that was still missing. So we decided, let's take the same plug and play deliverable aspect that a shipping container allows, but outfit it with all of the components necessary to help sustain a reliable crop production directly there within the community. We realized in doing this that presented a much larger opportunity. By doing that, by leveraging clean technology, we could effectively help fill some of the global distribution gaps that left entire regions out of healthy food access, and instead use it as an enabling mechanism to reframe what our food system is and how our food system is actually in relationship to our planet. Well, this is where Farm from a Box comes in. Our goal is to revolutionize local food production and enable local communities around the world to grow and sustain their own healthy crop using clean technology. Now, each unit is powered by renewable energy and comes equipped with all of the core components needed to support a sustainable, high-quality crop production year after year. Off-grid power helps farmers produce at a much lower cost, extending their growing season and reducing post-harvest food losses. Solar-powered drip irrigation provides a consistent flow of water to support productivity through dry seasons, through droughts, while also enabling production of high-value irrigated crops that may not have been possible with rain-fed irrigation. Internal solar-powered cold storage brings in the missing cold chain that so many areas lack and help keep the fresher longer. And because each unit has Wi-Fi capabilities, we also developed a complete IoT system to improve operational efficiency while also optimizing energy and water usage. It helps provide ongoing farm management and guidance. And it also, with sensors integrated on all of the core components, help us be able to provide remote support, which is particularly important for all of these rural remote locations that we work in. Now, a significant advantage that we offer is that our system is entirely crop agnostic. We can grow absolutely any crop in combination of crops that work within that particular area. This is important because we're using clean technology and pairing it with regenerative, agroecologically based growing systems to be able to make sure that we're sequestering carbon, we're rebuilding the health of the soil, and we're increasing the biodiversity in the areas that we work in. Now that you have a little bit of a better idea of what our system is, let me tell you where we are. We've developed 2 different products ranging from supporting 2 to 10 acres of thirsty irrigated crops. We can go beyond that if we start looking at commodities. And we've deployed these units within the United States and also primarily East Africa. Now, within the US, we've worked with schools, we've worked with commercial farms, we've worked with urban farms, and we've also worked with indigenous communities. Now, this farm is a project that's in Pine Ridge, South Dakota, on a farm called Rebel Earth. It's their mission to build healthy, locally grown, and culturally significant food for the entire surrounding Lakota community. They provide training on how to grow your own food while also reintroducing traditional plants and herbs to the broader community. This farm is a farm that we launched in partnership with the World Food Program and the western border of Tanzania. Now, while Tanzania has great agricultural potential, 80% of the population relies on subsistence farming with limited access to infrastructure that can help support much more reliable and quality crop production. Now, what was a community on the periphery of one of the refugee settlements struggling with food insecurity and with malnutrition, they are now a community-owned farm cooperative that is primarily women-owned and women-led that produces food all year round. Now, taking the lessons that we've learned from this project, we're now expanding our work into large-scale supply chain initiatives. We're working with women cooperative farmers in Liberia, and we also have an upcoming project coming up in Uganda, also within a refugee ecosystem, helping develop agricultural value chains. Now, with this innovation, we can build local markets of cooperative producers that were not previously incorporated into the market at all. We can help rebuild healthy food hubs and food access in areas that have experienced volatile food prices, are experiencing import-export disruptions or import reliance, or are also struggling with civil and environmental disasters. We can also press the needle forward and be able to really help build and strengthen food security and resilience in communities that are on the front lines of climate change. Now, all of this technology already exists, but we're dedicated to getting it into the hands of those that really need it the most and harnessing the power of community-driven regenerative farm practices to sequester carbon, rehabilitate land, make sure everyone has access to healthy nutrient food, spare our oceans of nitrogen runoff, and reframe the way that our food system is actually going and keep it much more locally based and shorten those supply chains. It's an honor for us to be a part of the EC50. We look forward to meeting you and hopefully collaborating with you on building a much more nutritious and sustainable future for us all. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's hard to express how humbled I am to be in such impressive company. Today, I wanted to talk briefly about an international collaborative effort that I'm part of to study how climate change affects plants on the world's highest mountains. So, climate change isn't uniform across the globe. After the poles, the Himalayas are expected to be one of the areas to experience the fastest warming relative to the global average. And, in fact, these changes may be even greater in degree at the highest elevations, meaning that the alpine region, that is, those areas above treeline, will see extreme changes. Alpine plants are therefore threatened first by direct effects of climate change, temperature and precipitation, second by increased competition with lower elevation species that may now be able to grow in the alpine region, and third by climate-driven changes in land use, such as increasing harvest pressures. When we combine this with the fact that alpine vegetation is often intensively used by Himalayan indigenous peoples, it's clear that the area needs urgent documentation. To do this, we joined Gloria, a shared methodology used at a network of more than 100 permanent plots in alpine areas. Our subnetwork within Gloria spans sites across 3 countries in the greater Himalayan region, Nepal, Bhutan, and China. Now, long-term monitoring projects like this are rare enough, but ones that can draw together insights from these very different countries are especially powerful. The people who make it happen are not only the botanists from each country who lead the teams, but also the botanical garden workers, the students, and the local people from mountain villages around the sites who join the studies. At each of the sites, we work on 4 mountain summits, which range in elevation from treeline up to the limit of plant life, which in our areas is roughly 5,000 meters above sea level. On these summits, we install temperature loggers, compile plant lists, and conduct intensive surveys of plant presence and abundance in small plots. Then, after a 7-year interval, we return to repeat the method and gather the data that lets us assess change. Relocating the exact plots in an area like this can be a difficult process. Even with GPS points, photographs, and metal detectors, it can be quite a treasure hunt. And at elevations above 4,900 meters, both botanists and the plants that grow there have to deal with extreme weather conditions and the alpine changeability that earns this area the moniker 3 seasons in an hour. But in exchange, we also get to experience a unique and astonishing diversity of flora. These include many endemic species, plants found nowhere else in the world, and therefore of particular conservation concern. So, the Gloria network in general is primarily designed to ask how plants respond to climate change. Our team adds ethnobotanical methods to ask how people are responding to these changes. These methods include interviews with people about the uses of plants, and also working more broadly with participatory activities such as maps and historical photos as ways to start conversations with local people at our sites about the changes they've experienced. Although the areas we work in have distinct floras and use cultures, there are also many similarities and overlaps in both the alpine plant species and in the ways that they're used. So, we've now conducted at least one resurvey at 7 of our 9 sites, and we hope to return to the final 2 next year. And after recovering the temperature monitors, we're able to see clear signs of warming. So, these are results from 2 temperature loggers we recently pulled out of the ground at Jomolari in Bhutan, which show that even at summits of different elevations, which experience different baseline temperatures, we can see significant and consistent warming. And while this is only 7 years of data here, it comes in the midst of decades of warming at each of the sites. So how do plants respond to this change? Looking across all of our sites, we observe an increase in the total number of species, but also we can see the first signs of lower elevation species beginning to move up into the alpine region. This suggests a future where a reduced area is available for the unique alpine flora of the Himalayas. These aren't huge changes that we're seeing just yet, but it's striking that it happened over only a short interval. Older Gloria sites in other parts of the world have seen accelerating changes as they visit for resurveys, which is certainly something we'll be looking for in our next pass. Despite these increases in species, which include increases in useful species, indigenous Himalayan communities observe traditionally used medicinal plants becoming harder to find and alpine pastures declining in quality. So their adaptation strategies have included experimenting with new crops to take advantage of warming temperatures and, sometimes in collaboration with me and my partners, trying to design new procedures for the more sustainable collection of wild alpine plants and exploring possibilities for alpine plant cultivation. So finally, going forward, we hope to continue to use local perceptions to inform our ecological methods, build local capacity so that this can be a sustainable long-term project. And of course, we're always looking for ways to get our data into the hands of land managers, advocates, and policymakers who can affect real change. Thanks again to the Explorers Club for putting this all together, to the rest of the EC50, and especially to my fellow innovators. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Welcome, everybody. It's really an honor to have you here. Very often when we bring people together, we're united around thematic ideas that bring together very, very different disciplines. And in this case, we actually have a subject matter that hangs together very neatly, very cleanly. Plant material, planting, its cultural usefulness, its economic usefulness, its relationship to climate change. This is a rather tight package of conversation. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see how much detail we can get down into. I often start by just talking about this notion of exploration and the 2 parts of the term. The idea of going out somewhere, going out into the world, that's the X part of exploration, to go somewhere. And the plore part which is to bring something back, to yield value, to speak, to reveal. And in both of your cases, these both are very, very much involved. There's a lot of value back involved in the work that you do. Because of that, I'm going to start with you, Brandi, because it's very explicit that this is about value back. And just starting from, I know in the video it's sort of clear the origins of this, but I'd be curious about process, about when you're in the field, when you are there, how does this play out in a specific community?
And that's a great question. And thank you for the opener, because I think that's where the plore part also comes in, is that when we do these deployments, we want to make sure that we, step one, are listening and paying attention to wherever it is that we're working in. And there's an important factor that's there, because we do not want to be a part of this sort of Western mentality of like, we know exactly how to do everything, so we're going to teach you how to do everything. We want to bring in that plore part, say, okay, we have the clean technology. Let's pair that together with regenerative agricultural practices, but also really listen and bring in a lot of the traditional practices that have happened within that area that we're working in too. And then we have the opportunity of being able to really learn and extend that knowledge to some of the other deployments that we do also. So we really try to start off first and foremost with listening and with asking to make sure that what we're bringing in is also a good fit, while sort of cross-pollinating, if you will, with the knowledge that we have and that we can learn.
This interesting thing about Western expertise and indigenous knowledge is right at the center of both of, I think, where you guys work. And that question of listening is really, really the way one has to listen is so absorptive. I'm curious, and I'm going to go to you, Robbie, for a second about this, because you talk a lot about talking to people about what is there and the odd constellation of values, not just material value, but cultural value, symbolic value, spiritual value in plant material that we might not normally regard as being so.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and thanks for bringing it up. And I think it's really about taking the time to listen, as Brandi said, but also realizing that takes time. That's one of the really nice things about Gloria as a long-term monitoring project, is that community relationships are a long-term process too. And a lot of local communities, have experienced plenty of people coming in on very short timelines, and they know how much those sorts of projects can offer. And we're really lucky when we get to have these longer timelines. I didn't get to experience that as a graduate student. As a graduate student, you're always working on a very short, limited timeline. But to be able to take the time to forge these relationships and find those places where very different value systems can meet. My mentor, Jan Salek, has done a lot of work on sort of finding the overlaps between traditional sacred areas in the Himalayas and the goals of biodiversity conservation. And these aren't always aligned, but there are definitely places where they overlap. And that's true of other places we work too, like Madagascar.
Brandi, you're working a lot in areas, I would say, that are stressed environments, crisis environments, the opposite of this, environments where human activity has leached out capacity. And now what you're trying to do is kind of recover capacity. And I'm curious, let's see if I can frame this right. What you're bringing is a technological thing into this environment. I mean, it's a pretty elaborate technological solution. How does that integrate when that lands in a place where these people are, where there's been subsistence farming or some other, really very, very local little cycle, and what you're bringing is such an interesting way of generating capacity. How is that received, and how do you integrate that? I mean, I'm looking at, it looks like there's computers, there's solar collection, there's electricity, which in some cases these places otherwise don't have. So integrating that is not as simple as bringing it. There's got to be a whole cultural process of integration.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And Robbie, while we're not working in the Himalayas yet, there's a common thread of where we're working to rebuild a lot of these areas in connection with the land. There is still this sacred grounding that happens with it. So in the beginning, Joe, you said it perfectly. It kind of looks like this transformer or spaceship that comes in. And I think before we even land our technology, we make sure, again, we're speaking with the community. We're saying, here's what it is that we can bring. Is this in alignment with what you're looking for? Here's what this can do. Here's what this can do. Here's how this may be able to integrate with your needs, even above and beyond purely from the agricultural perspective. So we do a lot of discussion in advance, and we try to make it as participatory as we possibly can. And the interesting thing too is that land and plants and food and where we're sticking our fingers in the soil, it becomes a sacred place. And this is whether we're working in sub-Saharan Africa, or quite frankly, whether we're working in the US. We have a farm that is working with resettled refugees from Bhutan and Nepal in California. And California is not going to feel like home, right? But the farm becomes this community anchor where suddenly the surrounding neighbors can now connect with their new neighbors, and everyone can connect with each other and just sit and be in the space. And there is something about that that is just incredibly, incredibly grounding and nurturing and filling as a human again. So we really try to make sure that not only are we using it as a technological anchor in terms of power access, connectivity, water access, but quite frankly, we use it as an emotional, psychological, and spiritual anchor as well. And that's a part of our approach that I think is really important.
I know we were just talking about land, the sanctity of land, the groundedness of being connected to land, but there is something interesting to me as well about, I'm going to call it somewhere between power and empowerment that comes from being exposed to capacity, right? This installation brings capacity. There is electricity. I could maybe do other things with electricity. I could cross-utilize this solar power. Computers, there's a whole awareness, a world awareness that comes with this, like a portal into another whole question of capacity, of voice, of power. And I'm wondering if you have seen any of that sort of cascade in communities where you've brought these rather interesting potentialities.
Absolutely. And my favorite, quite frankly, is with women. Once those barriers come down and these women are empowered by this capacity and empowered by being able to have access to this technology and training, which traditionally they struggle to get access with, they kick the door open. Suddenly that's it. They're soaking in all of this information. And where they did not have any of this access before, suddenly now they receive this training and they're pairing it with that classical sort of ancestral wisdom of how to really plant in partnership and in union with the earth. They're suddenly the ones that are teaching and are the experts. They're advising the agricultural extension agents that are in the area. I mean, they absolutely are empowered after that. And it's one of my favorite things to see because it's like a rocket ship. It's the best. And that's where you know that you're really making a big impact, especially when we're talking about gender-based barriers.
I'm also interested in, Robbie, in the, you're seeking out indigenous knowledge about, in frankly, a declining pool of indigenous knowledge. And so are you finding any evidence of generational transfer, or because of the pressures of, pressures on culture, gender transfer of indigenous knowledge in the areas where you're working?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And, it's something that has worried people and they've remarked on for many generations, right? This sense that sort of traditional knowledge and ancestral knowledge, especially about environmental place, when we see environmental places changing rapidly, is being lost. but that's also a clue that it's dynamic. Just the observation that people have been remarking about this being lost for so long suggests that, in fact, there is intergenerational transfer going on, and that part of what's happening is, the reason that the younger generation seems to know less is because they're still young and they haven't become elders yet. So we do certainly see that. We see, we definitely have a sense of traditional ecological knowledge as a system that's dynamic. And so it can incorporate new information. It can incorporate new observations about the world. And it can also survive disruptions. So one of the things that we see in the Himalayan region, and this is something that's interesting because there are actually some similar dynamics going on with expatriated Himalayan communities here in St. Louis, which what Brandi was talking about made me think about. But we see some generational skipping, that the generation of people sort of maybe a little bit older than my age are off working in cities, but their parents are living in a village, in a rural area. They're maintaining some sort of traditional agriculture and traditional gardens. And those people's grandchildren, the working generation's children, are being sent home to stay with the grandparents, and they're acquiring some of this traditional information. And they're also, I will say, from a selfish perspective, wonderful field assistants and local collaborators, because there's nothing that elders like more to do than to talk to their grandchildren and the young people of their community about this traditional knowledge.
And Brandi, because you mentioned that quite often you're bringing the farm from a box to communities that have undergone some kind of crisis. Ecological crisis, political crisis, some reason why the normal cycle of agricultural relationship is broken. But under the conditions of climate change, I'm curious why that just isn't everywhere.
I mean, therein lies the question that we're all facing right now. And soon it is going to be. Areas are changing so rapidly. I mean, we look at every single year, the West Coast is on fire. So the framing of what we're looking at in terms of crises and disaster is also evolving. So while we have, experience in working within the refugee ecosystem and trying to nurture the relationships and capacity and access between refugees and the host communities that the refugees are within, there's still a lot of commonalities, quite frankly, that are shared between that situation and climate refugees, or areas where, quite frankly, they used to be able to produce and now they aren't. And so they're just moving further and further out onto the fringes. We really like to use our infrastructure as a way to sort of batten that back and say, let's rebuild in these areas. Let's re-strengthen in these areas. And in order to do so, you're going to need some sort of supplementary assistance at this point, which is off-grid power, because there was no, connectivity and no grid access to begin with. Certainly water to be able to stabilize things. And then that's where the regenerative agricultural practices come in too, is because every single time there's nurturing of the soil that has to happen in order to make it a long-term solution also. So it's interesting for us because we're constantly listening and paying attention to what those crises are. At the same time, we look at what's going on in island nations that are so import reliant, and you realize, my God, they're incredibly insecure. There's no self-reliance there at all. So let's be on the proactive end and try to actually strengthen those areas with locally produced food systems anyway. So there's a lot of different ways in which we can do it, and we're kind of constantly learning. But crisis now has a lot of faces.
Obviously, one of the ways any species adapts to underlying system change is migration. So when you have a culture that is grounded in its spiritual relationship to a set of plant materials that have meaning and have function, and yet those plant materials are migrating north, or they're migrating uphill. They're migrating possibly into another entire cultural community. For example, in the Himalayas, there's a pretty clear altitude distribution between Hindu kind of, southern biased communities and northern, ultimately our ancestors are horse nomad kind of communities, in which as the plant material migrates, it may migrate out of relevance. I'm curious if you've seen any of this, or if you are attuned to it. Are people attuned to it? Is it a thing people talk about?
The reason I'm smiling as you ask that question is because we've actually worked with some collaborators to sort of propose a conceptual model that's exactly what you described. So if you'd like to volunteer to be one of the grant reviewers for this grant that we keep submitting and keeps getting sent back for revisions, that would be wonderful, because this is an idea that's very exciting to us. It's certainly true. So one of the things that our long-term monitoring program is explicitly set up to look for is plants moving up the mountainside. So plant populations, that is, shifting from lower elevations to higher elevations. Obviously, as you say, people are usually more fixed. They're connected to hard infrastructure like roads and villages. And there's this vertical zonation, especially in the Himalayas, of different ethnicities. I will say, though, that actually, in a way that's analogous to high mountain plants, high mountain peoples have had to live with this sort of thing for a long time and to interact. Often, people from different sorts of communities at different elevations are coming to mountaintops and ridgetops for these natural resources, things like open pasture or medicinal plants that only grow in the alpine. And so there is some longer term experience in having to negotiate sort of intercultural arrangements around how you deal with these things. There's also a sense that that these mountaintop areas have been places of intercultural meeting and transmission of seeds and transmission of ideas for a long time as well. So I do hope there's some sort of like built-in resiliency in the system to deal with those challenges as well.
What I'm curious about is to describe kind of a great day. What is a great day like? So I'm going to start with Brandi, and just like, what is a great day like?
Oh, that's an easy one. My favorites, absolute favorites, and I know that this is the same for the whole team, is deployment day, because that's that moment when everybody is ready, the preparations have been made, and then this thing arrives and there's this unfolding, and you can feel it. I mean, you can feel the excitement of it. One thing. Oh boy, we can't ship a unit with a giant solar wing on the roof. So there's this unpacking. And so there's something about it that also just feels like it's a big gift that's arriving. And so the feeling of that is something that's really, really palpable. And at the same time, everybody works together. The project in Tanzania that I put in the presentation, that one was amazing because I'm out there with the entire community and there's language barriers, but suddenly we would all just have this battle cry where we would say, Oshirikiano, Kalimongoma. And suddenly everyone was just like working and doing it together. And there's something about the unity of that goes across languages, across anything. Suddenly there's this thing that is really bringing us together at this nexus. And hands down, those are my favorite days.
I think for us, it's got to be the high summits that we get to, which, and in this company, maybe they're not very high. It's 5,000 meters above sea level. But we're not mountaineers, really. We're not alpinists. We're botanists and ecologists. We bring students with us, even if they're students from the country. Maybe they haven't spent a lot of time in the mountains before. So it's a struggle for us to bushwhack up these steep mountainsides, directly to these high summits. And these are places that have been set up with baseline data before, but maybe not all of us have been there. So as I mentioned in my presentation, it can be a sort of treasure hunt. We're looking at photographs we took before, hoping that the GPS points were taken correctly in the baseline data, and then searching around with metal detectors until we find some of the buried markers that we've hidden at the summits. And then, exhausted, soaking wet, to turn on the laptop and see the little signal from the wireless temperature monitor that's been sitting there for 7 years, taking hourly temperature recordings, that just sort of pops up and says, "Hi, I'm here. I've been working this entire time while you've been gone." And we know we have then the temperature data we compare with plant data to really tell a story about the direct effects of climate on Himalayan plants.
There is something binding about work itself. Most of the field work that I've ever done is as an artist, which you'd think would be a very solitary kind of job, right? I'm the artist, I'm the one making the painting, I'm creating the art. But the moment you indicate anything that looks like any kind of labor, like, oh, that guy needs water. I got to go get some water. He's setting up a table. Let me help with that. I mean, oh, you're going to have to tether down this canvas. Oh, I got that. I can do this. Everybody comes together around work. And this binding property of work makes community. It makes community. So then once you have a community, then you're sort of connected. I'm curious how you guys maintain connection, more to the indigenous people whose lives you've become part of. And I'll start again. I'll start with you, Robbie, because it's a little more nuanced, because you do come and go, on the basis of some kind of expedition.
Yes, I think that maintaining that sort of continuity is really important, and also sort of, quite frankly, building the capacity to make the external international teams non-essential to the process is also important to us. So repeat visits are one thing. We'll come back, and so our ecological methods are fairly well paired to maintain this continuity of contact with the people at various stages of perhaps indigeneity, right? With very local mountain communities, with students who may be from indigenous communities or maybe from national majority communities, and with scientists who also in these areas, maybe from national majority communities or other minority communities within each country, China, Nepal, and Bhutan. And so with the students and the scientists, we can interact with them a little more in between the surveys. The students, of course, move on within a space of 7 years, but we're able to work with them, publish with them, and place them into other programs as is appropriate for their interests. And of course, with the scientists themselves, we can maintain more of a continuity of ongoing publications, and incorporating ourselves and them also into the broader network of these mountain ecologists who are doing similar methods.
It's interesting because, Robbie, we've had very similar experiences, and I find that Joe, you said it perfectly. Work bonds us, and there is a relationship that is really built by breaking sweat together and having that connectivity. And we classically end up bringing people on board as a part of the Farm from a Box team from deployments that we actually do. So building those relationships is something that's really important to us. When we think of indigenous communities, to your original question, the first one that really comes to my mind is also the project that we're doing in Pine Ridge. And this is working with an indigenous community that is nomadic, right? But they are not used to sitting and farming. They're used to following their food source, not planting it in that way. So there's something also about nurturing that relationship and keeping that relationship going, because there's such profound respect for the fact that this is also a cultural change at the same time. And while we're really happy to help build food sovereignty and independence and all of those things, there is a deep mutual respect in not only working with each other, but keeping the learning process going, because it's a learning process for how they are also building this localized, planted food system within their community. And there's a lot of discussion around that, saying this isn't traditional, so why are we doing this? So being a part of that ongoing dialogue is also something that I think is really important too, particularly when working with Indigenous communities.
Another thing that I wanted to sort of dive into is one of the reasons we're bringing all these people together, one of the reasons for the Explorers 50 whole enterprise is to create a kind of new alchemy of internal relationships, a new system of conversation that is lateral inside of our organization. By bringing in people who you might not have originally thought of as being part of this category of explorer, to extend the notion of exploration itself, and then to extend the sense of how that conversation proceeds laterally. So in the spirit of that, I'm always interested in what the two of you might want to know from each other in the context, especially now, because it seems like these are rather interrelated subjects, what you might want to know or discuss or connect over between the two of you. And I'll start with you, Robbie.
Oh, that's a wonderful question. And in fact, that's something I think a lot about in a role that's slightly different from my ongoing long-term monitoring projects in the Himalayas, which is my role as director of the William L. Brown Center here at the Gardens. So we're focused on ethnobotany, on people and plants, and we have deep roots in agriculture, in the sort of quest to feed the world and make sure that people have the nutrition, but also the nutritional diversity and the livelihoods they need to survive. And so coming at this from the perspective of a botanical garden, where our sort of pure science interests, if you can call it that, are about botanical diversity and the exact identity of species and varieties. My question always is sort of, what can we do for you? How can really deep knowledge, not from me, but from my institution, of plant diversity around the world aid in your specific task in the Farm from the Box, or if we go into maybe the specific goals of a community like Pine Ridge, how can it aid in food sovereignty? There must be some ways to leverage these big old accumulations of knowledge that natural history collections like botanical gardens are, to these sort of newer goals or more newly expressed goals we have.
May I dive in then, Joe? Because Robbie, let me say first and foremost, I propose that I carry your backpack and we really discover this on site. That's what I would really like to do. Secondly, I agree with you 100% in terms of biodiversity. It drives me crazy when people are like, tomato. And you're like, oh my gosh, no, there is such a nutritional richness of different types of tomatoes and corn and garlic and seeds and all of this. And so there's an educational component that's there also to really be able to expand people's views, especially when we're talking about the nutritional aspect of things. So there's rich area for us to be able to actually collaborate on that from both the educational side, but also in cross-pollinating. Again, I keep saying this word, but cross-pollinating between whether we're working in Virginia, whether we're working in Liberia, wherever we so happen to be working, there's information that can be extended there for different varieties. So yes, and let's please discuss this on the mountaintop.
Great. I look forward to it.
The entirety of the notion of a shipping container, the computers within that shipping container, the solar collectors and the rare earth materials necessary to make the solar container, the whole thing is a byproduct of the massive expansion of Western culture, its technological bias, and its capacity to massively consume resources to make these things. And then it brings with it, so that all that comes with the thing, that's all there. And often the disconnect between that and where it goes is right in the realm of maintenance. I mean, anyone who's ever been to the Himalayas, for example, bridges all over the place. They were great the day they went in, and now you're like going one hand over the other on one cable because maintenance. So how do you, there's an opportunity side of this, of like, this is the gateway into technology. Someone has to maintain these computers. That means they have to know about computers. Someone has to maintain solar panels. That means they have to know about solar panels and how they work. So the opportunity to grow intellectually by engaging with the thing, and also how you solve the problem, these are related, of maintenance of these things so that they don't take on that odd momentary quality that so often we see in this part of the world, where something went in once and was spectacular, like there's like electrical poles running down the valley and there's no wires left on them. You know.
Such a good question, because we've all seen those out in the middle of nowhere where you're like, what is this? It's a ghost of a project that at some point in time existed, but what is it now? Maintenance is a huge factor. And first of all, I think there's a weight to this technology as well that you noted. One way that we try to make sure that we are working within that is by, again, localizing it in the same way that we try to localize the food production and localize the supply chains. That means we, in turn, as a business, need to also uphold that value and localize it as much as we possibly can. So we take the time definitely takes some time to actually set up localized fabrication in the countries that we work in as well, because we think that, one, it plays a huge role in terms of maintenance, that we're not sending in these specialized parts from, only California and Silicon Valley or Quebec or wherever it so happens to be, but that we're really tying in parts that have been sourced there locally, which mean therefore they can be resourced again there locally, and that those ties are there. We also want to make sure that, again, we're building the system in country, because that means we're contributing not only from the food production side and supply side, but to the infrastructure side within the country and those capabilities. So every step of the way, we really try to sink our feet in country as much as we possibly can. With the maintenance, one of the other ways that we've gotten around this is, quite frankly, using data. And data ends up providing us this remote monitoring capability. So in addition to the technology, we have a whole IoT system that from New York, we can pull up the whole system in Tanzania, wherever we so happens to be working, and be able to basically triage the health of the system quickly on one dashboard. Like, okay, here's what's going on with your battery state of charge. Here, somebody accidentally left the cold storage door open, and so your energy is being depleted. We've learned the human nature aspect of maintenance at the same time. The perfect story of this, and I'll try to make it quick too, is in Tanzania, in the beginning, when we had this whole system, all of our farmers sent us a panicked WhatsApp saying, the pump stopped working, like our whole field is going to go down. We're like, well, there's no way that's going to happen. Let's pull it up. From San Francisco, we pulled up the dashboard and we were able to see that it was just the water filter that needed to be flushed. The seasonality of silt in the river had just increased the silt. And so it just wasn't making it out into the lines. So rather than the whole system being repurposed into other things, which can happen very quickly, or having somebody dissect the pump and try to figure it out, and there we go, there goes the pump, that data system does help us be able to provide the ongoing support, but it also helps the communities be able to learn how to be able to really triage things and maintain them too. I agree, maintenance is hugely important. So that's the way that we address it.
So long-term hope for what it is that you are doing in the world, and then your specific hope for how integrating into the Explorers Club can influence, alter, or add value to that ambition.
One of the downsides to environmental monitoring, especially long-term projects that can match the long-term scale of climate change, is that they don't sync up well with grant deadlines and 1 to 5 year reporting schedules for scientific research grants. This is something where, because of the nature of the beast, it takes a long time. So we think a lot about sustainability in terms of sustainable funding, in terms of raising local capacity, and in terms of designing methods that can survive being transferred across people and across generations, in fact, and making methods that are sort of simple and straightforward enough that we hope that the majority of sites will continue to survive. And this is something that's true across the entire global Gloria network, that this was designed for this purpose. So I guess the long-term goal from a pragmatic point of view is that these sites continue to be maintained, that they can increasingly can be monitored, and also the data analyzed and interpreted and leveraged by increasingly local concentric circles of scientists. So in 20 years, Ashish Dami, who started with us as a younger MS student, is going to be running the program completely in Nepal. And then maybe 40 years after, it's the Local Villages Project. But also that information is used to really inform policymakers. And so that gets into the second point, which is one of the advantages of doing this project at these remote sites is not just gathering the scientific information, but in fact that like they are inspiring, amazing, aesthetically incredible places. And I think that offers a chance to tell a story about climate change that can come at people from a slightly different direction, and hopefully convince people to take action in maybe a different way than some other stories about climate change. It's all important. And so I would hope that, the Explorers Club is a perfect place for that, right? It's a perfect place for me to gain sort of knowledge and advice about how to tell that story in a compelling way. But also just to connect with other people who, like Brandi, say, oh my gosh, let me come and see this site too. That sounds incredible. And bring people into the project and engage them in the project, both in the Himalayas, but indeed in Gloria sites around the world. We're in nearly every major mountain system now. And so the more support these sites get, the greater a chance there is that they're resurveyed in 7 years, 14 years, 28 years, 77 years.
It's such a good question. I think about this daily. We really on the horizon want to see local and regionalized food systems flourish in a sustainable way, flourish in a regenerative way. We as a company really want to see these localized pods all over the world become this interconnected network where these small farmer cooperatives are suddenly able to compete on a global level, but using much more sustainable techniques. From the scientific side, we want to work hand in hand with the scientists all the time so that we are carbon soil monitoring and knowing that we're pushing the lever in the right direction in terms of sequestration, that we are helping monitor pests, that we're helping monitor pollutants in the water. And I think that's where this opportunity of continuing to build out and develop this data core of each one of these infrastructural pods that we're deploying is really going to come in handy. One thing that we've started to step into also is partnerships and collaborations. We're working with MasterCard to be able to provide remote digital financial banking access and interconnectivity and bringing the markets to these areas that do not have market access and advancing them beyond farm gate sales. So I think continuing to develop this data component and work with other collaborators to again build this interconnected network of these smart farm systems. New York is agreeing with me on that one. So that's the vision that we have, is really just resilience, and collaboration, and keeping things regenerative and clean as much as possible.
Well, thank you, Robbie and Brandi. That was really an incredible conversation. Everybody, come back next time. Our next uniting theme is activists. That should be pretty interesting. And remember that it is time now for new nominees for this year's cycle of the Explorers 50. And information on that is available at explorers.org. So please, if you know anybody who might add to the richness of the club, nominate them, and let's see what happens next year.